All right, guys, so welcome back. We're going to continue on in the story of the Roman world. So, just kind of as a brief review, last lecture, we just kind of started a little bit on the Roman world, talked a little bit about geography, talked a little bit about the birth, the origin stories of Rome, and really kind of set into motion the big theme before your midterm, which is how the Roman values and characteristics helped Rome succeed. And much of the success of Rome happens during what we call the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic covers a long period of time, hundreds of years. There's the rise and the fall of the Roman Republic. So we're going to kind of do a couple lectures on the rise, and then we'll do a lecture on the fall. So here we have our first set of keywords, right? So just kind of get these down. Obviously, again, Roman Republic, 509 to 27 BC. You have these terms, patricians, plebeians. Polybius is a primary source, should have read, and I'm going to explain the senators and the councils and all of this. So I guess the first thing we need to kind of understand is, what does this word republic mean? I think that's kind of the first thing we need to know. Because when you talk about a republic, there's a lot of societies in the world that call themselves republics. We know what a monarchy is, right? A monarchy is rule of a king. We know what an emperor is. An emperor is rule of an emperor over a large piece of real estate. Republic is a kind of a funny term because it depends where it's used, right? The United States, we're a republic, but so is, China calls itself a republic. North Korea calls itself a republic. The Romans call themselves a republic. And they're not all the same. But what in this case, the Roman Republic, because that's our concern, how is the Roman Republic different than the Roman monarchy or Roman Empire? Well, in an empire or monarchy, they had one guy ruling. When we get to 509 BC, the Romans decide we don't want a monarch. We don't want a single king anymore. Instead, we want a rule of more people having a say, right? And so they create a very complex system, actually, that involves a lot of moving parts. And so the first thing we need to do as we talk about the rise of the Roman Republic is understand how the Roman Republic functions politically. So that's going to be kind of the big theme we do today, how the big objectives, how they function politically, and how they deal with some of the problems that they have domestically. So this is where we're going to see a good example of problem solving, right? Remember last time I was talking about adopting and adapting, and I talked about core values and problem solving, where we're going to see a really good example of this in today's lecture of problem solving. So I guess we could just kind of start here by looking at these terms. There isn't too many things I need to show you right now other than these words. And to understand the Roman Republic, I guess the first thing you need to know is there's two groups of people, patricians and plebeians, right? The patricians, they're about 10% of the population. Everyone else is plebeians. And when the Roman world begins, you have patricians and plebeians. It goes from the very start of Roman history. And the way it works is the patricians, they are the ones who govern. They are the ones who rule during the political system. The plebeians, what is their job? Well, the plebeians have two important jobs. Number one is that they are the workers. They work, they do the fields, they do all the labor stuff, and then you have them also as the backbone of your military. So they're not insignificant, in fact, very significant. But when the Roman Republic begins in 509 BC and they oust the monarchy, they decide that the only people who are going to have governing power are the patricians, right? So keep that point in mind. That's going to come back in a few minutes. All right, so we have patricians, we have plebeians. By the way, if you remember Hammurabi's code in the beginning of the semester, there was references to patricians and plebeians, and that's where they came up with that translation. All right, so now you have the source on Polybius. Hopefully by now you read it. You had that little discussion on it, and if you hopefully did that. And then what I really want to kind of explain to you is how the governmental system worked. And I just put a couple terms here, senators and councils, but if you read Polybius, you got a little bit more detail on this. So you just want to have a basic understanding of how all of this works. So during the Roman Republic, they decide that they're going to have kind of this system where you have Roman senators. So a few things you need to know about Roman senators. There's going to be 300 Roman senators at any given time, right? So these are all the little notes. You always, just not the word, but everything I say. So 300 Roman senators. Once you become a Roman senator, you get to serve for life. You serve until you die. So that's important. There was kind of this rule that you wanted to be wealthy, you had to be a patrician. Remember, when it started in 509, you had to be a patrician, and they kind of preferred them to have some wealth, but that was kind of a more informal rule. And then they also wanted you to be of certain age. I believe the age was 30, yeah, 30 years of age to be a Roman senator. All right, so you'd serve for life. You were 300 of them. You're 30 years old. The question is, what do they do? What are they responsible for? And if you read the Polybius source well, Polybius, this primary source, tells us that the job of the senators was to basically deal with the money. They deal with the money in Rome. They're the ones who have control of the finances, right? So you definitely want to know all that. Then there's also the councils. Now, who are the councils? Well, they're kind of your executive branch. There's only two of them. And why did they do two instead of one? We have one president. Why do they have two councils? The reason they have two councils is because, again, they're looking to get rid of a monarchy. They don't want one guy with too much power. So you have the Roman senators. And by the way, the term Senate, yes, why do we have a Senate? It shows you how long this term goes back in history. And when we have our senators, right, we use that term, Senate. So anyways, councils, there's only two of them. You only serve for 1 year, right? The senators get to serve for their entire life, but councils only serve for 1 year, and then they have to go away, and somebody else gets to be council. And their number one job is to handle the military. Now, this is the thing that I hope you kind of picked up on, especially if you read the Polybius source, which is, what is Polybius describing here? And what he's describing here is a sense of checks and balances. I mean, think of our government today, right? The President of the United States, he is the commander-in-chief, controls the military, right? The finances, however, are controlled by Congress. So if you have a president who wants to fight a war, well, okay, it's the military is under his authority. However, to fight a war, you need money. And if Congress doesn't approve the money, then war is not going to last very long. And that's that kind of checks and balance system that you already see in the Roman Republic. So this is kind of cool. It's, again, one of those contributions we get from ancient history to our world today. Now, obviously, if you studied American history and our founding, our checks and balance system, I'm sure our founding fathers were aware of this, but they were also very influenced by, somebody, like Montesquieu talked about the checks and balance system, an Enlightenment thinker that I covered in my History 111 class, a bit from France. But that's centuries and centuries later. But you can see where this idea starts from. All right, so that's essentially how the Roman Republic works. Now, it's much more complicated than this. There are other positions called censors and quaestors and praetors, and you don't need to even worry about those. I didn't even put those up as key words for you. Those are, if you ever study Roman history and want to know more about them, you can. All right, so that's essentially how it works. Now, the thing to keep in mind and emphasize, when they create this system in 509, only patricians are involved. All right, so the plebeians in 509 BC, when this is all created, have basically no say-so. All right, so here's our map again of the Roman Republic, and now Rome has a problem. And again, when we're talking about Rome in 509 BC, we're still basically just talking about Rome. We're not even talking about all of Italy yet, right? Just to give you perspective. So the big problem Rome is going to have early in the history of the Republic is, what do you do with these plebeians? 90% of the population that had no rights, no representation, and they are the backbone of your military, and they are the ones who work. Well, this is a problem, and the Romans find a way to solve it in what we call the struggle of the orders. So we're going to spend some time on this slide. So this is a whole other event called the struggle of the orders. You can see it's a very long event. It's about 200-year period, and you're going to want to know each of these points and what it is. So let's spend a little time discussing what the struggle of the orders is, because this is one of the more significant domestic events inside of the Roman Republic. So again, 509 BC, they create the Republic. It doesn't take long for the plebeians to say, hey, wait a second, we don't have any rights, right? We don't have any rights, we don't have any representations, and the question is, what happens? And what you're going to have is a 200-year period, and this is a term I like to use to describe this event, of evolution, not revolution. What does this mean? This is pretty important, because what happens is, it's not as though the plebeians say, well, we're not being treated fairly, we're going to burn everything down, right? Because the plebeians, remember, what's the most important thing for Rome? Rome, country, family, right? That's what matters, not your own self-interest. And they understood, even the plebeians, that it doesn't do anyone any good to just have revolutions, right? Revolutions rarely, from an internal perspective, if you try to revolt against a different country to break away, it's a little bit different. But from an internal perspective, if you start having revolutions like the French Revolution, all fought inside of France, it's pretty bloody and brutal. And so what they wanted was evolution. And what that means is gradually, over almost a 200-year period, the plebeians will get more rights. And this is what the struggle of the orders is all about. And it's a really good example of problem solving. But it also takes the patricians to realize, hey, the plebeians need more rights for our society to function well. So you can imagine this is a 200-year period, and if we were to talk about all the details of the struggle of the orders, we'd be talking about it a long time. So I just gave you here 5 highlights, right? We're going to go through all 5 of them. You want to know all 5. So for each one of these, know what it is and understand why it's part of the struggle of the orders. So number 1, the creation of the tribunes. What is the tribunes? Well, the tribunes, that's a new group of people who sit in a political body called a tribunate. And there were just 2 of them at first and later 10 of them, but they're all plebeians. So now you have the senates, right? You have the councils, and now you also have the tribunes who represent plebeians. They are plebeians who sit in the tribunate, and they have now authority to represent plebeian interests. They can have a voice. The plebeians have a voice now. And so this happens very early in the struggle of the orders. You don't need the dates for all of these specific things, but the creation of the tribunes was in the year 471, right? So that's when they created the tribunes. I'll give you the dates for them as we go through them. But you don't need to know exact dates, as long as you know kind of the chronology of what happens. So 471, they create the tribunes. All right. 2, 12 tables. This happens a little bit later. This is in the year 450 BC. They create the 12 tables. What are the 12 tables? It's a codification of Roman law. And so now all the laws in Rome are written down. And you go, okay, how does this help the plebeians? Well, if the laws are not written down, obviously the group of people who's going to have the bigger problems are the people who have less resources. And so plebeians tended to have less wealth than patricians. And so by writing down the laws, the plebeians know where they could do, what they can't do. They can't be abused that way. And so it gives them, some feeling at least that, hey, all right, the patricians are willing to put down the laws. The other thing is, once you put down the laws, then you can change laws you don't like. So first you have the creation of tribunes, 471. Then you had the 12 tables around 450. And then there was another law called Lex Canulia. You don't need to know the name of the law, but I definitely want you to know what happens. And this is a few years later in the year 445 BC. And it's basically a law that allowed patricians and plebeians can marry each other. So up to now, if you were born a plebeian, you're going to die a plebeian. If you're born a patrician, you're going to die a patrician. And now you can marry each other. And so it gives plebeians a chance to rise up in society as well. And so that's something that kind of helped make many of the plebeians feel better. Next, the 4th point, we jump ahead a bit to the year 367. And again, you do not need to memorize these dates, right? 367, and by then what had happened is there were laws passed reducing the punishments for debt. So if you couldn't pay your debt inside of Rome, what would happen? Well, the punishments would not be as severe, which is important, not as draconian punishments. And the reason that's important is, again, that helps the poorer plebeians. And so they're like, hey, I get taken care of well, and if I don't pay my debt, it's not the end of the world. I'm not going to have my life destroyed. So it kind of, you still have to, you work, got to pay debt and so forth, but the punishments were less severe. And then finally, the last point, by the time we get to the year 287, this happens gradually over a series of events, all the political positions in Rome were opened up to plebeians. So while in 494, when the Roman Republic started, you had to be a patrician to be a consul, by the time we get to the year 287, You could be a plebeian and you could be a consul of Rome. It wouldn't happen often, but you could do that. And so this is what we mean by the struggle of the orders. It's kind of this evolution, not revolution, that is significant. The reason this is important is because it gives Rome political stability. They're not fighting bloody civil wars. They're not tearing each other apart. They're not burning down cities. They're not attacking each other in the streets, right? And this is important when you think of any democratic society, right? Even if you look at our own US history, if you have people thinking that the only solution is going to be through violence, well, that's not going to be a very good solution for a nation, right? It's eventually going to tear you apart. So this is what we see in the struggle of the orders is kind of evolution, not revolution. And it really took both people. It took the plebeians to realize this is not a good idea to burn down their own nation. And it took the patricians to realize, hey, we need the plebeians, let's work together. So it's kind of interesting points there. All right, so anyways, now the last reason this is all significant is because of this political stability, it allows Rome to do really what it's really known well for doing, which is growing and expanding beyond Rome. So we're going to get into our story of the Roman expansion here. And the Roman expansion, we're just going to start it here a little bit, essentially talking about how Rome expands through Italy. And then next lecture, we'll see how they go beyond that. So get these terms, right? And it's just a few words regarding Roman military. And here I'm going to kind of skip forward here in a second. I'm not going to stay on this slide. So make sure you get all the terms there. All right. Okay. And let's look at our map. So when Roman world starts, it's just, just this little dot here. And the question is how Rome going to expand to pretty much everything you see colored on this map during the Roman Republic. And then afterwards, they're even going to get larger, right? Even when we get to the Roman Empire. But much of the expansion does happen during the Roman Republic. So I guess the first thing you need to know about the expansion of the Roman Republic is the way Rome does this initially is form an alliance with people living in Italy. So southern Italy here is different than the rest of Italy. See, much of Italy has something in common with the people who speak in Rome, who live in Rome. They all use the Latin language, which is significant because if you have a common language, that helps bond you. And so they're all here, they all speak Latin. Now, in the southern part of Italy, that's not true. The southern part of Italy, the boot there, remember when we talked about the ancient Greeks, that area, they are Greek. They speak Greek. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But much of Italy is going to be Italian, so Latin speaking, excuse me. So what do the Romans do? They go to their neighbors early in the Roman Republic around the year 450 BC, and they talk to them and say, hey guys, why don't we create a Latin League? Where these Latin neighbors of Rome work together on building projects and defense projects if they need, military projects, and they agree to work together. And it was pretty effective. It had some ups and downs, of course, but overall worked okay. After about 100 years, again, this is all the very brief version of this. I took several courses just on Roman history when I was going to school, so there's a lot more information on this, of course. But over about 100 years, the Romans go to their Latin neighbors and say, hey, how about we just become part of Rome? Abandon this idea of a Latin League, and you guys just become part of Roman society. And they told them, if you guys agree to this, you could be Roman citizen, which was good, because you want to be Roman citizen. Because if you're a Roman citizen, you have the rights of a Roman citizen. You have the backing of the Roman military, which we're going to talk about here in a second. And one group you do not want to mess with as we move forward in our history here is the Roman military. And we'll see some of that as we go through our stories here. But definitely this is something that began the Roman expansion. Now, to go beyond Italy, they do need a strong military. So let me kind of describe to you the military a little bit. I put a few terms there, and then I'm going to show you some pictures here as well. Because when you talk about the Roman military was very powerful, just like the Spartans, except the Spartans, there were 9,000 of them, right? The Roman military is going to be massive in size as we go through the years. A Roman military machine usually consisted of what we call Roman legions. 5,000 Roman soldiers created a legion, right? One legion. And the Romans had many, many, many of these legions as we go through the Republic and then the Roman Empire. And they were very well trained, very well disciplined, right? One of the characteristics I said about Rome, one of their values is discipline. We see this in the military. They would train, they would be taught never to retreat in battle. They would walk in very tight formations with these shields that would go from the chin all the way down to the ankle. They kind of curved a bit. I'm going to show you a picture in a second. That's the scotum. And they had these little short swords known as the gladius, and it was very effective. They had good cavalry forces. They had these catapults that could hurl boulders, right? You know, boulders that weighed 100, 200 pounds, 100 yards away. They had what are called ballistas. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. It's kind of like a giant crossbow. And all of this was very effective in the Roman military machine. Let me show you a few pictures. All right, so this is what I mean by a Roman legion. And you can see this is a group of Roman reenactors, actually, kind of a fun event I went to once down in Fort Mac down in San Pedro. They did this thing every year where they brought in all these military reenactors. And you can see what I mean here. This guy's holding the gladius. You see the shield that I was talking about. This is how they walked. And it was very well done, very well organized group of soldiers. Okay, so that's the legions. This is kind of the ballista I was talking about, like a giant crossbow. They kind of showed one working. It was kind of fun. And it's just an image of a catapult, right? And so all of this very effective in Roman military success. Now, where things get a little bit more interesting is when Rome wants to go down to southern Italy. So this is going to be kind of our last story here on this lecture. So if we look at our map here, Italy is now under the control, much of Italy is under the control of Rome, except for the south. Southern Italy, and here you see a few more key words we're going to talk about here as we go through this. Southern Italy was really ruled as a Greek society, very heavily controlled by the city called Tarentum. All right? So Tarentum, get that down, is a city in southern Italy, right, that is Greek. And the Romans say, we want to control Tarentum. And so the Romans begin to mobilize their forces to move down to conquer Tarentum, a Greek city. The people in Tarentum realize this. They're a little worried. What do? They go to get help. Who do they get help from? This man named Pyrrhus, who is the king of Epirus. And where is Epirus? Epirus is right here. It's hard to see on this map, but it's right over here. It's one of those kingdoms. Remember, after this is where you have to get the chronology straight. We're around the year, when this is all happening now, about the year 290 BC, right? I think that's actually important to note. I don't think I put that down here, so let me just jot it down here. So we're around the year 200, circa 290 BC. By the time we get to 290 BC, the Greek world had ended. Alexander had ended. Remember, after Alexander, everything kind of falls apart and fragments into different parts. And so in 290 BC, we're at a stage where there are these little kingdoms, including the kingdom of Epirus over here in Greece. So the people in Tarentum go to Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, and say, hey, will you help us? And Pyrrhus says, yes, I'll be happy to help you, my fellow Greeks. And so there are these wars that are fought between the Romans and Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, for control of southern Italy. And what happens is Pyrrhus wins. He wins battle after battle after battle. But this is the important point you need to know about these wars that the Romans have with the Greeks down here. Every time Pyrrhus wins a battle, he loses a lot of men. And in one of the battles, even his own son is killed. And so he wins these battles, but there's a term for this, and this is the term, your phrase you see here, Pyrrhic victory. Definitely a good word to know. It's another one of those words we have in our English language that I'm hoping you've heard at some point. What is a Pyrrhic victory? Pyrrhic victory is named after Pyrrhus. It's when you win, but it comes at such a great cost. You either lose a lot of men or a important person. That's kind of a defeat. I remember years ago I was watching a Sports Center clip, and the announcer was going, oh, there was this great football match, but the best player on the team was hurt, and he suffered a season-ending injury, and it was a Pyrrhic victory for their team. And so, I was surprised he actually knew the term, but Pyrrhic victory, in other words, that they won, but it came at such a great cost because their best player was hurt. So we still use that term today, Pyrrhic victory when you win, but the cost is so great, it's not worth it, right? This could be used in politics. Maybe there's in military, in sports analogy. It could be used in many times. All right, so the Romans win. At the end of the day, they wear them out, and as a result of that, they take over the entire Italian peninsula. All right, well, we're obviously not done. This is just the beginning because, yes, Rome takes over Italy, but then they want more. And the question is, what's next? And of course, when they look at their map, the next logical piece of real estate that Rome wants is the island of Sicily down here. And so Rome says, we want Sicily next. Well, there's this other civilization we haven't talked about yet that we're going to in our next lecture because you see right here in North Africa, there's another civilization known as Carthage. And Carthage was a very powerful civilization that dominated North Africa. They had a strong navy. And Carthage said, well, we want Sicily. And what is going to emerge out of this is the first of three major wars, what we call the Punic Wars. And these Punic Wars are very significant because these three Punic Wars will essentially determine the course of Western civilization. Three massive wars, Rome versus Carthage, first over control of Sicily, but eventually over the entire Mediterranean Sea. And so this is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to do our next lecture on the Punic Wars, and we'll go from there. So we're still, as we do that, we'll see more examples of adopting and adapting, problem solving. We're going to see a lot of that. So for this lecture, obviously more of the domestic things. The struggle of the orders is really important, really good example of problem solving, and the beginning of military expansion of Rome, and we'll do more next time. All right, that's it. Thank you very much, guys. Have a great day.